Thank you for joining us this evening to what is the first in this, I guess, new series, the spring series of provocations, of discussions essentially that we started last term, and we had 4 great speakers, and all of those are available on YouTube for people to watch. But we're lucky this spring term, we've got 3 speakers, and this first one we're incredibly fortunate to have, particularly today, because just by chance it's kind of coincided with what is the beginnings of a big, there's lots of momentum around a campaign around fighting inequality. I've got with me a copy of Ben's book, and hopefully other people have also seen this. This was something that galvanized my interest and understanding around what Ben was kind of trying to communicate. And Ben's had a kind of a really interesting path in terms of the organizations and places that you've worked. And so first of all, just wanted to welcome you, Ben, and thank you so much for joining us. I know you were, you've just come from an interview. But rather than me giving a kind of patchy story of kind of who you are and where you're from, I wondered if you wanted to just start it off, Ben.
Sure. So inequality matters to me, not so much, you know, isn't it interesting? Sometimes people take a subject and they think, isn't it interesting? I think that inequality is obscene and immoral and dehumanizing. As has been pointed out by theologians, dehumanizing to the rich as well as to the poor, and is completely unnecessary. My background was in development. So what I was first interested in and passionate about was about tackling poverty. And what I realized in that work quite early on was that the crisis of the exacerbation or perpetuation of poverty was a flip of the coin of the crisis of the concentration of wealth and power. In other words, if we wanted to do something about exalting the humble, then we have to do something about humbling the exalted. We'd have to do something about why is there not a trickle down, but a kind of vacuum suction up of wealth and power, and why has there been across most of the world for the past 4 or so decades that we had to address this. So my background was in that challenge of poverty, and it became pretty clear early on that the issue was inequality. I then got to get to work with a whole load of people on different issues, for example, on democracy, or on human rights, or on the climate, or on women's rights. And what was so interesting was so many people in these different streams have converged into this river that is recognizing that unless we address the challenge of inequality, we're really held back from achieving, you know, any of what we want to do in terms of social progress and decency. So that's the kind of backdrop, I guess, to my work. And this has been a journey, I would say. You know, I've tried to read a lot and study a lot, but I've not done so as an academic. I've done so as someone who's in the work. So working, you know, on the front lines. My start in this work was living in a township in South Africa just after the end of apartheid, and I've worked in slums in India, and I've kind of tried to pick up from that experience and from some amazing people that I've got to work with. What's the answer? How do we break through this? Because for me, it's not enough just to find a subject interesting. I think we have a moral obligation to do something about the inequality crisis. And really excitingly, and this is the thing that I cover in the book, inequality is beatable. We can actually do something about it. So we don't just have to be ever more informed commentators on disaster. We can actually be protagonists in making things better. And that's, I love that. That's really, really exciting. And I'm really looking forward to chatting about how we do that today.
So I think that last point's really interesting because that overlaps with a lot of the philosophy and ethos around radical school geography, that idea of people as actors within society and young people being part of society as well. But maybe that's something we can come to in a minute. What I'm really interested in as well, just to understand, is that path of, so did you, when you were working in some of these places, was it that you were a teacher very early?
I have been a teacher. That was my first work, was as a teacher in South Africa. I was teaching English and I was teaching computer studies, and I had wonderful conversations with students about Macbeth and what Macbeth meant in terms of power. And I learned so much from having it read back to me from their experience. These are kids that had just come out of having won the struggle against apartheid. And as I talk about in my book, that is an example of a struggle which now sometimes people associate with a few famous names. Nelson Mandela, they say he's the one that ended apartheid. And it's true that Nelson Mandela is a hero, but the true history of that struggle was it was ordinary people who kept it going, including school kids, including the famous 1976 protest by kids that were refusing to be taught in Afrikaans, which was the language of apartheid. So all of that work, including as a teacher, what it's really taught me is the power of what I call extraordinary ordinary people, the everyday heroes. And when we look back at transformative moments, the famous faces, the figures who then become celebrated, are really just an embodiment of a much, much larger process. And what excites me is that firmament underneath, is because I think the big name heroes will come along. They're created by the moment, but it's the organizing of thousands of ordinary people that creates that moment. And it's including, as a teacher, learning from other teachers and learning from kids, I would say crucially, that a lot of these lessons that are in the book have come through.
Just before we move on more to the inequality element as well, that you have spent time in lots of different parts of the world as well, because I think that's an interesting kind of perspective as well. Do you think that colors, what ultimately comes into the book, but in terms of who you are, is that part of it?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, I'm talking to you now from Italy. I've lived in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in North America. I'm married to a woman from India. My life has been an international one. I think there was a former Prime Minister of the UK called us citizens of nowhere, and that was a bad thing. I'm an internationalist, and I think that there is a huge amount that we can learn from different contexts. And one of the things I found exciting is that though it's really important to recognize that every place is different and particular, and that's what makes the world so wonderful, that when we look at some of the lessons about how a social movement is successful, it's so exciting for me to find the huge commonalities between these very, very different contexts. So I hope that international experience brings something useful. But what I would also really, really stress to people is that if you want to be in the work of social change, it really is about working with your neighbors. It's about being involved in your local community, in your workplace, in your neighborhood, or in your local faith group, or in the hyper-local community. And so I think sometimes there can be a danger of, especially folks like me who've lived all around the world and know lots of people all around the world, and I can chat with lots of people on social media all around the world, that recognize that when we look at true change, it does need to root itself in the local. And what it then needs to do is to connect more broadly.
So is that maybe where then you apply this to a school context? Is there's so much potential for a school within being the heart of the community? as modeling so much of these behaviors and being a catalyst for this, like you say, within a rooted location?
Absolutely. I mean, a school is a physical place. It's a community of people. Wonderfully, it's a community of people of all classes and races and backgrounds who, from the process of being together, in situ, learn to get along with each other, learn to understand each other. It's also a workplace of teachers, and it's also a community hub of parents. So schools can be wonderful sites of social change. And we've seen that with the climate movement. We've also seen that, for example, in the movement to protect people who are being deported, that in the abstract, people might say, oh, I want to get rid of these outsiders. But when someone hears that the family of the kid in their kid's school is about to be thrown out, they rally in defense. So schools are a really beautiful site of change, and have often been a very, very important part of progressive social change.
Shall I throw it to you, Ben? I think what we wanted to do was give you a chance really to throw out those provocations and
Sure.
hopefully lead to some more discussion and debate. So.
Great. So I'm going to share some thoughts around inequality, and then I'm going to share some thoughts about what that might mean for teachers and for work in schools. To start with, I'll just share a few things about how harmful inequality is. So we know that before COVID, about 7 in 10 people around the world lived in countries where inequality was increasing, but now since COVID, it's 10 in 10. If you look at the Oxfam report today, it shows that the 10 richest people have doubled their wealth, whilst 99% of humanity have seen their incomes fall. They show that every 4 seconds, there is a death that relates to inequality. The ILO showed that workers lost 3.7 trillion in this crisis, and Forbes showed that billionaires have gained 3.9 trillion. In other words, there's been a transfer of wealth from workers to billionaires of around $4 trillion. There's a beautiful book by Wilkinson and Pickett called The Spirit Level. I really hope that you will all read it. And that sets out a really important point, which is that inequality is a public bad. The worse that inequality gets, the worse violent crime rates, the worse the murder rate gets, the worse even obesity and teen pregnancy rates get. You can plot on a graph the proportion of people who work as private security guards on one axis, and it goes against inequality on the other axis. In other words, you could think of inequality as like an elastic, and you pull it and pull it and pull it, and then it snaps. Society snaps. Inequality holds back progress on overcoming poverty. It lessens social mobility. It undermines social cohesion. It threatens peace. It hurts democracy. The IMF even says it's bad for the economy. And if you talk to folks like Greenpeace, they will point out how it obstructs progress on the environment. Now, I used to spend a lot of time, I used to spend 90% of what I was talking about in talks like this on why inequality was bad. Some real progress is this. Now people say, yeah, of course it is. Get on with it. What do we do about it? And I'm really glad that that's the point that people have got to in the debate. In my book, How to Fight Inequality, I looked at when had inequality been beaten in the past, and therefore from that, how might we overcome it again? Now, what do I mean by beaten? I don't mean a society where there was exactly the same income for everyone. That doesn't seem to have ever existed, at least not in written history. It might have in prehistory, pre-written history, but we don't know. But there's no evidence of it ever existing since we've had written history. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a society where the whole country managed to sustainably and measurably and substantially lessen the gap between those at the top and everyone else year on year for, say, a decade or that kind of time. Now, we find really two clusters in the past century and a half. Now, one of them is from the 21st century, from this century that we're now in, and that is Latin America, from about the year 2000 to about the year 2010 or 2015, something thereabouts. And that's about 8 to 11 countries substantially reduce inequality. So that's a really interesting modern day case study. If teachers want to work with kids, that would be to look at the success of Latin America in reducing inequality from a very, very high level in that decade or decade and a half. The other is much, much broader, much, much more international and much longer, but it's in the 20th century. Now it ends in about 1975, 1980, maybe thereabouts. When does it start? In Europe, it starts, in parts of Europe, it starts after the Second World War, although in Scandinavia, it starts in the 30s or 20s. In England, it arguably starts even earlier, perhaps going back to 1890 or 1910. In Africa and Asia, it goes to the 50s or 60s in newly independent countries, depending on when they got independence. So a very, very broad sweep of countries for a very long time period, sometimes known as the Golden Age. Now, that's another period that you could look at with students. So those are, if you like, my two clusters. And what I wanted to understand was, what was it that led to success in those eras? So let's start with the first point. The first point is that it was always a policy question. So it was never corporate CSR, it was never philanthropy, it was never an NGO project, it was never just communities were able to do it by themselves. So if teachers are studying with kids processes of what you do about inequality, we need to be honest. If the mechanism is a charity project, then the historical evidence of that changing a country is zero. Same with CSR. So it's always government policy. The second point is it's never one policy alone. In order to reduce inequality, you can't just do one thing. So sometimes people get quite messianic about some ideas, like universal basic income, which is basically just giving everyone some money of an income every year from the government. I think it's a good idea. I think UBI is a good idea. And variations of that exist world over. Child benefit, which is essentially a UBI for parents, and pensions, which are essentially a UBI for elderly people, are forms of that, and they are very successful. And if you look at the Latin American case, child benefit, for example, was often very, very important, but it was not enough on its own. And so when the World Bank talks about how did Brazil make progress, they talk about Bolsa Familia, the child benefit program. But if Brazil had only done Bolsa Familia, they wouldn't have reduced inequality. You need a package of measures. This important point because it relates to the process of change. But the other important thing around that is that although it's not one policy, it's not that much of a mystery. It's not rocket science. It really isn't. So what do you need to do? You need to do things like put cash in the hands of ordinary people, also, child benefit, pensions, UBI, things like that. You need fair taxation, progressive taxation on the rich. That means taxes, higher progressive taxes on income, graduated taxes, not taxing too heavily VAT or consumption. It means that you need to tax fairly businesses and things like that. So there's a taxation element. Public services, free health, free education, water, housing. These play a really, really important part. Wages and workers' rights plays a really, really important part. Tackling the legacies of discrimination plays a really important part. And land redistribution, especially in rural societies, plays a really important part. If you do that mix, you can reduce inequality. So in other words, if a government was really determined to reduce inequality, they could pretty much ask a group of historians, economists, and sociologists, and social planners to work on it for about a week, come out with some policies and do them, and make very substantial progress. Now, I don't mean to demean the role of experts, but it's only to say that it really isn't that hard to think about what you need to do. What's hard is how to make that happen, because what's interesting, given that that's the policy mix that worked in Latin America, but it's also, by the way, the policy mix that worked in Europe at the birth of the welfare state. It's also the policy mix that was done in the States by FDR. So given that, why doesn't everyone always do it? And the reason is because governments are not evidence-led and they're not values-led, they're power-led. And so if you want to win those policies, you need to build power. So this is the second part, and this is what I really, really want to focus the conversation about, which is about the how. So it is important to know that there's a policy mix because it gives us optimism and sense of possibility. But sometimes people kind of look at that policy mix and then they just kind of hope for magic. They hope that just one election or just some good leaders or just writing in a book will make it happen. It doesn't. Lyndon B. Johnson famously said to Martin Luther King, look, I know what I have to do, but you have to make me do it. So we then need to look at what are the ingredients for change, the ingredients for how. I'm going to set out 3 of them. The first is collective organizing. If we look at that Latin America case, and I think it'd be a great one for folks to discuss with their kids, you can look, for example, in Bolivia about the indigenous peoples movement, in Brazil about the workers movement. I sat down with some landless workers in Brazil who lived in an area where they were taking coconuts, and they didn't own that land, but it was the only land that they'd ever lived on. And they managed, in fact, to get a change in the law that they would always have access to the fruits of the forest over and above property rights. They also managed to get creche care for their kids. They managed to get a minimum price agreed for their products. They managed to get access to water and sanitation. Here's what they told me about how they did it. They said, individually, we coconut breakers are small, but when we organized, we became visible. Everything we've achieved has been through the strength of our friendship. We got together in our community, then we linked with communities across the region. We went and got support from the trade unions, from the Catholic Church, from the wider public. We started an association and kept pressing for our rights to earn a living and live in dignity. On their t-shirts, this woman had this phrase, organizadas somos fortes. It means organized, we're strong. Now, if you look at what happened post-independence in African and Asian countries, you see again major action to tackle inequality. Why? Because independence had been won by movements that weren't only seeking to replace foreign leaders with native ones, but were trying to change society, make it more equal. In Ghana, the trade unions played an enormous role in the independence movement. And it was the cocoa workers who then led to the cocoa board. All the wealth from cocoa was going to a small elite and to foreigners. And by having a cocoa board, it would then, the country got the wealth, and they used that to roll out free education, first for the workers of children of cocoa workers, and then for everyone. If you look at the US from the 1930s to the 1970s, the New Deal, civil rights and beyond, again, you see a combination of pressures from below. You see a kind of Venn diagram, Black organizations, trade unions, activist groups, people like A. Philip Randolph in the middle of that Venn diagram. So this is how it happened. And in the States, for example, you see that in the 50s and 60s, these kind of policies were pursued by both Republican and Democrat governments. And then when you get to the 80s and 90s, neither Democrats nor Republicans will pursue them. In fact, a similar thing happens in the UK, in France, in Australia, in Italy. And the reason is that if you look at, say, trade union density, that's just a fancy word for the number of people who are in a trade union. It's when that goes down that inequality goes up. So the victory was not just the election victory, the victory was the pressure, the constant pressure from organized people. That is absolutely key and will be needed again. Scandinavian welfare state, I had been led to believe that there was something about Scandinavians, that they were intrinsically egalitarian. But when I went back and looked at the history, I found that they used to be very brutal, feudal countries from which people fled famine. And yet in the 20s and 30s, they were able to generate into much more egalitarian societies because workers and small farmers organized. The elite, in fact, tried to crush them. They organized strike breakers, they organized militia, but they were not successful in breaking the strike, in breaking workers and small farmers. So the triumph is not a triumph of any particular culture, but a triumph of organizing. Cesar Chavez, who was a farm workers organizer in California, he said, we don't need perfect political systems, we need perfect participation. So I think it'd be fascinating, for example, in a classroom to discuss the how of organizing. Let's take something like the Montgomery bus boycott. A lot of people know about the principle. You know, Rosa Parks refuses to go to the back of the bus, but often they don't know that that took a year afterwards, and it took 2 years of planning. 2 years of planning, a group of African-American women planned this, and then a year into doing it. And when for a year, they have to get people to work without using the buses, they were plotting maps of how everyone would get to work. They worked with the postman to work out the routes. they had to print loads of leaflets, and the only people who had printing machines were university staff. So university staff at night, illegally, on those old printing machines, were printing the leaflets. They worked with every single black church in Montgomery, because that's where people were on a Sunday. So it was a process of logistics and organizing. We fascinatingly discussed with kids that how do you win? How do you win through struggle? Not just what's the issue or what's the famous face or what was the speech, but that process of building collective power. There's a really important thing around a story. We won't have time to get into that too much today, but it's essentially this, that the technical debates were never enough. There was always a need for some moral overarching story, some overarching meme or idea. Joe Hill, the workers' organizer, he said, a pamphlet, no matter how good, is never read more than once, but a song is learnt by heart and repeated over and over again. In Britain in the mid-20th century, the phrase welfare state came from the Archbishop of Canterbury, not from a politician or from an expert. There's a wonderful movie that you could watch with your students called Roma. It's a Mexican movie, and it's about a domestic worker. And something really exciting happened after that movie, which was that a law reform to give domestic workers, that's people who work as maids in people's houses, to give them rights as workers, passed for the first time in Mexico. But when you watch that movie, you'll see that that movie has zero policy recommendations. What it did was it changed the story. So you could talk with your kids about, for a campaign to succeed, what would be the poster? What would be the song? What would be the slogan? And here's a third lesson, which is that when I looked back at what movements had been successful in tackling inequality, all of them had been seen as troublemakers. All of them had been accused of going too far, of being disruptive, of causing problems. Even the suffragettes who were only arguing that women should have the right to vote. Right now, a lot of white Americans will say, for example, why can't Black Lives Matter be more like Martin Luther King? But in 1966, 63% of Americans said that Martin Luther King was divisive. That's why John Lewis talked about the importance of good trouble. People like Wangari Maathai in Kenya, who's now loved by the establishment, associated with tree planting, was someone who they tried to assassinate at the time. All the people who are on the stamps are the people who once were stamped on. So it'd be fascinating to discuss with your students, if this is what, who are the people who in the past were being slapped around and who now we're told to look up to, and who are the people who are now being lambasted, who perhaps when these kids are in adulthood, they will be teaching their kids were heroes. So those are kind of three conversations I think it'd be great for teachers to have with kids. The first is about the how of organizing ordinary people, because collective power is the only route to winning change on inequality. The second is about that story beyond the technical. What's the poster? What's the song? And the third is that fascinating kind of revelation that actually every successful movement that tackled inequality was lambasted at the time for being troublemakers. So if you're not being lambasted, then you're not going to succeed, but based on historical evidence. Those are some conversations that would be great for teachers to have with their students.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. There's so much I want to unpack in what you've just said there. I'm going to do it sort of chronologically in a sense. The first one, this idea that, there's the spirit level, there's the inner level, these books which explicitly convey all of the information, so much data, so many graphs, which clearly communicate this sense that inequality is just bad for society. But there seems to still, particularly within the UK, be this sense that we need inequality, that it is just part of life, and that actually inequality is good. And even within schools, wrapped around that idea of meritocracy and the way that we push students to be competitive in order to achieve the best grades, there seems to be this system where actually we are perpetuating the idea that inequality is necessary, that it's part of society, and that there's this sense that we just have to have winners and losers. I don't know if you've got some idea around actually how we can try and help within the school context, try and really unpick that.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. One part is about how myths can dominate facts, that actually if we look at the success of the neoliberal revolution, the revolution of the economic right that led to this shift, people will think about people like Milton Friedman, for example, but actually it's people like Ronald Reagan, who was a movie actor. And really it's a triumph of myth. These ideas like meritocracy, for example, fall apart on any investigation. If you want to find a country where you are most likely in the world to make it from being, an ordinary person from a working class background to being successful in business as a big entrepreneur and very, very successful, it's Denmark. So the American dream is in fact only true in Scandinavia. And actually having a welfare state actually enables ambition. It enables risk-taking. So there's one conversation around myth. The other one, which is fascinating, is about how we teach communicates as much as what we teach. In part of my kind of odd journey around the world, I also spent a year as a teacher in Japan, as an English teacher in Japan, in a government school in a small town in Japan. And I had a fascinating moment of being called up by my head teacher. I complained to him because I said that I was finding it really hard to get the kids to answer me when I asked them a question without consulting their friends. I said, I want to know if they have the command of English. I want to test them individually. And they are messing up my tests because I will say, Masako, how was your weekend? And Masako will then turn around to Yuki and whisper, and Yuki will whisper back, and then Masako will answer me. And I just want Masako to answer me. I don't want her to ask Yuki, how do I stop these students doing this? This was my complaint. And I hadn't realized it. It was a real Anglo-Saxon individualistic thing to ask, but I hadn't realized it. And then the head teacher, wonderful man, kindly man, he said to me, very interesting. So in England, when you have a problem, a very difficult thing to solve, you don't ask anyone's help? And it was fascinating in terms of, the idea in the Japanese education system, which focuses much more on how do you lift the whole class through a challenge, rather than, how do you find the 3 or 4 brightest sparks and put aside the rest. And unconsciously, I was doing that, and unconsciously faced with a different experience, all I could see it as was wrong, was error. And it was in a way delightful to be corrected and shown that there was a different way of doing so. So I think it is really important that, there's a danger if we educate kids in a way that kind of says that some are excellent and some are not, that actually we are also recreating an unkind and a dismissive and a throwaway society. So that's also a risk. But a lot of people will say, when they talk about how they manage to get through difficult childhoods, they'll point to a teacher. So overwhelmingly, I think teachers are sources of reassurance to people that they do matter, and that they are of value.
The role that really a teacher that can spark and enthuse and drive. I guess what's interesting then as well is this sense of what it means to win and how we view winning within society. And actually, because it kind of also shows how inequality is linked to sustainability, and how it sort of underpins so many of these problems that we're currently seeing, is also that we need to emphasize far greater collaboration and community, like you say, lifting the whole class, rather than saying there are these people who are much better than, and you sort of end up having winners and losers. The one I wanted to get to next, though, was this idea about the government policy being the thing, that purposeful government policy can be the thing that really drives change, instead of, from my own personal experience, I know that so much of what teachers are emphasizing within the classroom is around the role of NGOs and the power of projects of a special, like you say, some sort of novel idea that for some reason seems to be shown to work, and this overemphasis of promoting the kind of good work of NGOs. And also, I think there's this fear from a lot of teachers to delve too deeply into reflecting on government policy, and sort of almost thinking like, well, the government makes a choice and it must just be right. And I think teachers have that balance.
There's a fear of it looking political, you know, but you know, I'm just saying, share with people the facts. You know, we could have a piece of paper, and we could write down, we could say, you know, this column is we're gonna list every country that moved from highly unequal to much more equal through NGO projects and CSR. And on this other side of the paper, we're going to list every country that's done it through government policy. And oh, there's nothing on one side of the paper. You know, I mean, that's just the facts. And so it's a bit like, I saw this wonderful thing on Twitter, the story around Brussels Airlines in the context of COVID, when many flights are empty, many people are not flying. But airlines want to preserve their space in airports. And if you don't land somewhere, you can lose your spot. So airlines are flying planes completely empty at huge expense. They're having to pay the pilots and staff and fuel, which is very, very expensive, just in order to preserve their slots. So there was a story about Brussels Airlines having hundreds of these completely empty flights. And someone had written above it, I'm going to have to use a lot of paper straws, you know? And there's something around, you know, we tell children, you know, pick up your trash, but we kind of worry if they are going on a march. And my own daughter was told by one of her teachers, protest doesn't achieve anything, you know. And she came back and said this to me, and I said, look, I study social change, and frankly, I can't find a significant change that didn't involve a protest. So it's completely ahistorical. So I think, you know, the first thing is, let's just give kids the facts about how it is that change has happened. It doesn't mean that it's the role of teachers to advocate for one way or the other, but it is a fact that the government use of social policy is what determines social outcomes. And the evidence of that is just overwhelming and irrefutable.
What you just said there as well, though, about the politicization of education, or the perceived politicization of it, I think is really interesting, because that's something we've been trying to grapple with as a group. That a lot of, particularly around responding to climate change and not advocating, but engaging with alternatives. Because I think this is also a question I had from a teacher who couldn't attend today, was this idea of how much of inequality is reciprocal from capitalism, how much of it is driven by a capitalist system, and actually should we be reflecting on the economic system that exists as a way to challenge inequality. But at the moment in the UK, teachers are particularly fearful of engaging critically around capitalism.
Yes, and it's interesting because if you look, for example, in during the Second World War, the Times newspaper ran a beautiful editorial about what is democracy, and they talked about how, you know, it wasn't really a democracy if people were left without social and economic rights. You know, this is a Times editorial, and you know, it'd be hard pressed now to find that anywhere in the UK press, or even, you know, an acceptable thing to say in mainstream conversation. But there's a need to interrogate different social systems and their outcomes. One kind of codicil I would make to your point around capitalism is that in terms of government policy, we've seen a whole range of different sets of government policies that could all be umbrellaed under the term capitalism, with vastly different outcomes. So there is the East Asian, Japanese, Singaporean, Malaysian, Korean story of capitalism. There is the Scandinavian, which sometimes called social democracy, but you could argue is a form of capitalism. There is the what dominated from at least from the 40s to the 70s as mainstream economic policy, that again you could say was capitalism, that is distinct from the hyper concentration of wealth and power in a tiny few hands, which is what we've ended up with today, and the outcomes they have are enormously different. I think the other thing that's really important when we discuss systems is also that we recognize that what system you end up with isn't like a debate club thing. It's about the balance of power. And so when people are thinking about, well, what kind of system do I want? If students or others are articulating that they would like something where there is a bit more restraint on those at the very top and a bit more hope and care for everyone else, then they will need to recognize that a kind of corollary of desiring such a thing is thinking through how on earth you get there. And historically, you only get there through collective organizing. So it isn't just saying, well, I wish I had this system, therefore I'll wait for someone and I'll vote for this or I'll write about this. They should also be exploring power and how it is that things get decided and why.
Should we then explicitly be teaching about trade unionism and the trade union movement and the kind of the history of that? Should that be more explicitly part of what we teach young people?
Well, yes, and I think for a number of reasons, and perhaps in a number of different subject areas. One is just that historically, trade unions have played an absolutely massively important role. The second is that as a practical level, kids want to learn things that will affect their lives. They want to learn practical skills. So they are interested in learning how to drive a car or how to bank or how to keep themselves healthy, things like that matter for their lives. Likewise, if they want to have an enjoyable life when they leave school and they go into the job market, they'll have a much more enjoyable life if they're working with other workers and making sure, for example, that when they have a baby, they get to have time off with their baby. That's something that you get from organizing through a trade union. No, that doesn't happen automatically. It's not given and it's not guaranteed. If you like having a weekend, if you like not having to work at night, if you like the idea that if you're sick with COVID or with anything else, you get time off and you don't lose out on pay for doing that. If you like the idea that when you're elderly, you won't be left alone, or that if you get sick, you won't be given a big bill, then a union is an important part. It's also an important example, and I think it's worth discussing other examples too, of people forming collective power. They could also be talking about women's groups, about neighborhood associations, about what people do in faith groups and all sorts of other networks in terms of student unions and school groups and things like that too. But that process of how people get together is a really, really key one. And it's kind of bizarre, although I'd say it's not bizarre because it's an intentional policy choice, but it's kind of bizarre that it's not taught. It's kind of a big gaping hole in for helping anybody understand how do they influence the world around them. Basically, unless you're a billionaire, you can't influence the world around you on your own.
Yeah, I guess if you're a billionaire and you want to get to Mars, or I think it's interesting because as a teacher, education sits within society and the perceptions of the general public, and kind of education is influenced by that. And so much of what through the media that we're being fed is that unions are an annoyance and a pain. And we've seen a decline in kind of union members that is because we've had that detachment from this idea that there are things like the number of hours that we work in a day, and like you say, sick pay, that have come directly from union organizing, that people, there's been almost, it's probably quite strong to say a rewriting of history, but the way that that's come about has been confused, and I think that's true also then of education. And it comes back also to your point about this idea of understanding the reality of history and how historical events and people have played a part, because I think often it's overly simplified. And also it's so true what you said about this idea that we look favorably on people, like suffrage or suffragettes, that at the time were completely, like you say, seen as troublemakers. And it's so interesting then to see that played out, particularly with the environmental sphere and people like Insulate Britain, the way that they are being portrayed and communicated. And then this sense of, we've got people within history who have played a similar role. I think there's an interesting bit there in how teachers can play a role in actually trying to help resolve some of that.
And I think that would be great to investigate some of those parallels. The other, one way of doing that is to look at, what is being said about the Insulate Britain protesters, and then what was said, for example, in New York Times editorials about the radical anti-slavers. What was being said about Gandhi, and what a dangerous man he was. But you could also, that's more of a historical comparison, but you could also do so between countries. So it'd be interesting to, for example, to compare the way in which we report in UK context, those who challenge authoritarian power in a Turkey or a Russia or a former CIS, or in China, or in East Africa, or in North Africa or the Middle East, and compare how we discuss them, those who challenge authority there, and how we discuss similar people in the UK. And we could just lay it side by side, and I think someone could perfectly legitimately decide that they think that disruption of society should always be avoided, and therefore it's more important to have stability and not disruption, and that they're willing to pay the cost that would mean in terms of justice in place A and B at times 1 and 2. And someone else could say, of course it's inconvenient. Of course I understand that it's disruptive to not be able to go to work because the roads have been stopped, or not be able to take your kid to school because the roads have been blocked. But recognize that these people are in a tradition that did X and Y, and would you have said, this is an outrage, they've blocked the ports, and I need to get my vital supplies from ports, and yet these people, these dock workers in Liverpool, have downed everything just to stop slavery. What would you have said, in those times? And put these things side by side and compare across time and place. I think that would be a good way to help elevate things away from the way in which, in particular times or in particular places, we caricature those who in other places we would call, dissidents and heroes, that when they're in our own neighborhood, we merely express contempt for them.
Yeah, I think that suggestion of an activity is a really easy, practical one that could be a really powerful tool, putting these things side by side and paralleling them. And because often what happens is you see them within different contexts, and therefore you don't compare them. And I think that's really powerful. We're probably coming about towards the end. I wondered if there was anything that you thought you wanted to throw in, Ben, before we finish. Was there anything else?
So I think, I guess what I'd really encourage people to do is to think about the role that kids are playing today. I think there are some really interesting ways in which kids are challenging us. They're challenging us on climate. They're challenging us on racism. They're challenging us on gender and sexuality. And I think it'd be really great to kind of, when we think about this process of organizing, to recognize that in fact, this generation of young people right now is one of they really are an organizing generation. So in this conversation, there's a risk that if you come in with, you know, hey, in the 1930s there was this, and there's a risk that you're kind of hitting people with something that's a bit too obscure, and also not recognizing that they are bringing a wealth of knowledge. So if teachers are applying some of this conversation that we'd have today, I'd really encourage them to start with hearing from the kids about what they are organizing for, or what they would like to organize for, or what they've seen their friends organize for, and then relate that to all these things that we've talked about, that in other times, in other places, some of these things that the kids have discovered organically have been explored in other places, and that the conversation about how it's been done in the past can be interesting, not just because it's interesting intellectually, but because if the kids want to win in their struggles around racial justice or gender justice or climate justice, then these are kind of tricks of the trade learned by others, and they will help these kids to be more successful in the organizing that they're doing. I think that this can be a really exciting subject to study, but I think even more, this generation of kids are amazing citizens, and anything we can do to help tool them up in the changes that they're pursuing, I think would be a really wonderful gift to them, but also ultimately through them, a gift to society. But mainly I'd like to say thank you to teachers, because I think you're all stars. As the parent of 2 teenagers, I'm really aware of how important teachers are, what a difference that you make, and I really appreciate the work that you do. And so if any of today is useful in your work, then that's great, and that makes me super happy.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's a really, I mean, both the thank you was a really good point to end on, but also the one you were just making there as well about the side of tooling up young people and starting from a conversation of saying, what is it that they're bringing as well? That's been a theme that's run through a lot of these talks, is actually looking to see what it is that young people are engaging with in their day-to-day lives, and using that as a way to then begin a conversation and develop, partly because then it helps with that sense of kind of appropriateness and usefulness to a certain extent. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it's a way in. But yeah, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you so much for joining us as well. I know that you've got so much on your plate. I was going to remind people of your book again, because it's such a good summary of everything you've been saying now. And yeah, thank you so much for all of the conversation. I've been throwing lots of the ideas onto Twitter. I know that you're a big user of.
Yeah, tweet me.
Well,
so tweet me at benphillips76.
And there's so much of what you've tweeted.
With a story, yeah.
And, yeah, well, so what we're trying to do is encourage people to share what it is that to continue the conversation, share what it is that they've used from this as well. We'll certainly do that one. And then I was going to point everyone as well to your Twitter, Ben, as well, because there's so many valuable resources that you share almost on a daily basis. So I wanted to say thank you as well to you and to all of the work that you're doing within this space, and helping to continue to push the message. And I really hope that the report that has come out from Oxfam really helps to stimulate, again, more and more of this discussion on a wider platform. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers, Ben. Thank you.
Bye-bye.